Ruslan Lynev, journalist. Alexei Rykov, revolutionary, politician, and man. Pictured on this page is the nameplate of the newspaper Izvestia. Izvestia of the Soviets of People's Deputies of the USSR is a daily newspaper published by the Presidium of the USSR Supreme Soviet. Founded in March 1917, daily circulation 10.5 million. Alexei Rykov joined the Communist Party in 1898 and served as a member of its Central Committee's Politburo from 1923 to 1930. He headed the Supreme Council of the National Economy, as well as the Labor and Defense Council, then succeeded Vladimir Lenin as head of the Soviet government from 1924 to 1930. "No one knows where or when I was born," Rykov would say jokingly to his family, referring to the fact that his date of birth, February 13, 1881, and the place, Saratov, were put down arbitrarily. Apparently, his father had failed to get the documents ready in his home community, Kukarka Sloboda, a rural settlement of Vyatka province, where he was registered as a peasant. Upon moving to Saratov, Rykov Sr. became a merchant. Soon after, however, he lost his wife and then died himself, leaving 6 orphans. The children managed to scrape a living and to pay their way through school by copper coins, as the saying goes, which they earned by coaching slower pupils. Alexei was one of the best students at the gymnasium, where he developed a particular liking for exact and natural sciences, and a particular dislike for divinity. Alexei started mixing in young revolutionary circles, and consequently the gymnasium authorities lowered his conduct mark, thus barring his way to the universities of St. Petersburg and Moscow. He was therefore forced to go to the nearest university town, Kazan. Rykov's first arrest came in 1901, and he was deported to Saratov, where he was brutally beaten up by the police during a demonstration. This event ushered in a new period in Alexei Rykov's life, which he was to recall later. "No sooner had I become a student than I was locked up. 12 years have passed since then, and of these I spent 5.5 in the lockup. Moreover, on 3 occasions I had to trek off to exile, which claimed another 3 years of my life. My brief spells of liberty were a kaleidoscope of villages, towns, people, and events flitting by. I used to be rushing about the whole time, by horse cab or steamboat. There was no flat where I lived for more than 2 months." Indeed, Rykov was exiled 4 times to Archangel province alone, but every time he managed to escape. He also escaped from Nadim, where he was twice exiled in the autumn of 1915. It was in Geneva, in 1902, that Rykov first met Vladimir Ulyanov, Lenin. Quick to spot Rykov's gifts as a good organizer and his ability to woo people, Lenin started giving him responsible assignments. For example, he was entrusted with the job of preparing a party congress and illegally reforming the party organizations disbanded by the Tsarist authorities. This particularly concerned the Moscow Party organization, which, as good luck would have it, he happened to lead at the height of the revolutionary events of 1905 and 1917. It was in Moscow that Rykov was elected delegate to the 3rd London Party Congress, 1905. Owing to his prestige in the Communist Party and rich experience, Rykov was offered one of the key positions in the first Soviet government, that of the People's Commissar for Internal Affairs. In actual fact, he was to supervise the formation of the new bodies of government. From the very start, however, Rykov and some other members of the Central Committee and the government disagreed with Lenin and the majority on whether the government should remain the way it was or whether it should include more representatives from other socialist parties, as the leaders of a major trade union of railwaymen, Vikshel, demanded. Lenin considered the demand absurd. Since the Congress of Soviets had given a clear majority to the Bolsheviks, why on earth should they cede to the ambitions of the minority? But Rykov, as well as Nikolai Milyutin, Vladimir Nogin, and Ivan Theodorovich, also People's Commissars, thought otherwise. Moreover, to stress their differences with Lenin and his position, they handed in their resignation. The malicious glee this incident caused among the enemies of the revolution They'd cry, "Look how stable the new government is." And the indignation of the Bolsheviks with Lenin at the head knew no bounds. One cannot understand the motives for that action today, either, unless one takes into account the main consideration. Rykov never acted contrary to his convictions. Much later, in 1930, Rykov was to resolve his differences with Stalin in the same manner. He stepped down as the head of government and thus made himself vulnerable. But things were different under Lenin. Later, Lenin recalled, "On the eve of the October Revolution in Russia, and immediately after it, a number of very good communists in Russia committed an error, one which our people are now loth to recall. Why are they loth to recall it? Because unless there is particular reason for it, it is wrong to recall mistakes which have been completely set right." Set right by actions. Soon after his resignation, Rykov was put in charge of the Moscow Regional Authority for Food Procurement. At the height of the Civil War and foreign military intervention from 1918 to 20, Rykov served as the plenipotentiary extraordinary of the Labor and Defense Council for the logistic supplies of the Army and the Navy. He would retrieve anything from the depots that might be of any use to the Red Army. The main munitions factories were restored and commissioned under his guidance. Such was the situation, and such were the actions. Small wonder that Alexei Rykov's resignation from the government became immaterial and was simply forgotten about. Economic recovery was the priority now. Who was the man to put the economy back on its feet? Who was to head the Supreme Council of the national economy? The party recommended Rykov for the post. Rykov, in fact, was the founder of that body, the man who set out the guidelines for its activity. From the nationalization of individual enterprises, initially turned over to elected boards, it moved on to the nationalization of entire industries run according to common output and maintenance plans. This project of bringing together the motley elements of the national economy into a single system under rigid centralized control made for better utilization of the available resources in the conditions of war and destruction. It was in Rykov's nature to combine the concrete analysis of a current situation with a look far into the future. For all the turmoil of the Civil War, with such urgent concerns as food and fuel, Rykov showed an interest in the plan to construct a canal between the Volga and the Don. Once the Civil War was over, it was time for drastic changes in the style and methods of economic management. That is why NEP, the new economic policy, was introduced. Assessing the period, Rykov came to the conclusion that now victory should be won not through commanding and monopolization, but through better work, by adopting a system of commercial management, as he put it. Commodity exchange between town and countryside, as well as trade in consumer and production goods, were the order of the day. That was a novel and complex stage of the economic recovery. According to Alexei Rykov, the nationalized industries were to be the backbone of this endeavor, especially the fuel and metallurgical industries and transportation. It was these branches that called for the lion's share of investments. But since farming was making more rapid progress than industry, at that level of the country's development, Rykov observed, the economic significance of the peasantry may far exceed the economic significance of the working class. Rykov concerned himself with virtually every aspect of the new economy, whether it be planned management or the market, both internal and external. Even then, enterprises were granted the right to enter external markets. His personal involvement was felt everywhere. But even at that early stage of the system of economic management, Rykov worried over certain flaws in its mechanism, which were to reduce its efficiency noticeably in the years to come. Addressing delegates at the 14th Communist Party Conference in 1925, he spoke of a spreading epidemic of inspections that gobbled up more and more funds and took a lot of time and effort. 1 billion rubles for inspections, but only 50 million for construction, chimed in one of the delegates in the hall, Vlas Chubar, chairman of the Council of People's Commissars of the Ukraine. No less evil to Rykov was the excessive overstaffing of the central agencies. They were losing touch with the subordinate enterprises, which were vibrant with new vitality. Changes at the bottom, but routine at the top. This is dangerous. The top will apply the brake to any movement down at the bottom, he cautioned. As deputy chairman of the Council of People's Commissars, and then, after Lenin's death, its chairman, Alexei Rykov was vested with special responsibility. True, his theoretical heritage contains no particularly large and brilliant works, but it is still valuable to us due to his experience of solving socioeconomic problems, which proves that at the most crucial periods, the party policy was determined by the economy and economic achievements. His pronouncements of that period, up until the late 20s, leave no shadow of a doubt that Rykov was a principled and active champion of the course of the country's emergency industrialization and of the all-round development of cooperation as a means of socialist construction. In practical terms, this meant the continuation of NEP launched under Lenin. But then this policy was reversed due to a slump in the purchase of grain in 1927 and 1928, labeled as a bread crisis and even a bread strike. Stalin saw the causes of the crisis in the growing resistance by the kulaks, rich peasants, and maintained that a bold thrust was needed in order to overcome the difficulties. He opted for emergency measures against those who concealed grain and for stepped-up rates of collectivization. This policy was carried too far. Rykov and two other Politburo members, Nikolai Bukharin and Mikhail Tomsky, saw this as an ominous sign. Protesting against the pressure campaign, Rykov, Bukharin, and Tomsky handed in their resignation. No, Alexei Rykov did not defend the bloodsuckers, the kulaks. He did not take up the cause of the rural capitalists, nor did he oppose collectivization as it was claimed. Neither did he preach industrialization at a snail's pace. What he advocated was the laws and methods of economics as opposed to the volitional pressurizing and command and administrative techniques being introduced into the system. That was the crux of the matter. Without going into details, we must say that it was not only Stalin with whom Rykov developed differences. A large number of rank-and-file party members were against him. Revolutionary ardor was more in tune with their mentality than NEP and its ways. To many, NEP was tantamount to bourgeois degeneration. These sentiments fell in with Stalin's way of thinking. He understood dialectics not as the unity and struggle of opposites, but solely as their struggle. So one of the opposites had to be removed, eliminated, especially if power was at stake. In this particular case, the right-wing deviation was the target. This was how Rykov, Bukharin, and Tomsky were branded. What is a deviation? This is how Lenin defines it. A deviation is not yet a full-blown trend. A deviation is something that can be rectified. People have somewhat strayed, or are beginning to stray from the path, but can still be put right. According to Stalin, the right-wing deviation, with its comic wailings about the emergency measures, was the main opportunist danger in the party. He also insisted, the truth in this particular case is that we do not follow a common line. There is one line, the party line, the revolutionary Leninist line. But there is also another line, the line followed by the Bukharin group, that is waging a struggle against the party line. This other line is the opportunist one. Accordingly, such a vicious campaign was launched against the deviationists that even their self-criticism, their readiness to prove by their actions that they supported the party line, were dismissed as maneuvering and subterfuge. Bow your head before the party. This demand, directed to the Trotskyites shortly before, was now addressed to Rykov. This was no hollow sound to Rykov, who had devoted his whole life to the party and who, by the will of the party, had been elevated to the high post of the head of the Soviet government. Therefore, at the 16th Party Congress in the summer of 1930, he recanted. The shorthand report may give an idea about the nature of his self-criticism and the atmosphere at the Congress. From here, there's a small section covering this passage from this Congress shorthand, so I'm going to read that along with the names emboldened so that you know who's speaking. Lyubchenko, one of Rykov's ardent supporters shortly before. Author. Do you agree that the position of right-wing deviation is that of petty bourgeois liberals? Rykov. Well, this very combination of petty bourgeois notions and liberalism, where I am concerned, is not quite clear. Maybe you can explain it to me later on, in a private talk. Lyubchenko. You'd better read Stalin's speech. Laughter. Commotion. Rykov. I repeat, very likely there are many things I have not said. Voice. The main thing. And have omitted. But I've tried to explain the main thing. Voice. But didn't exactly explain it. Around which all my differences with the Central Committee revolved. Voice. You'd better tell us about party discipline. Commotion. You should listen to what I say. It seems to me that our position is essentially that of defending the petty bourgeois resistance. Voice. That's putting it mildly. But let us change the scene and the time. Let us return to the present and set out on a damp day in early spring for Preobrazhenka, a street in Moscow. Let us visit, after a prior phone call, of course, Natalia Rykova, the daughter of the Sovnarkom chairman. She lives in a small, light, one-room flat, which is simply, even modestly, furnished. The first thing to catch your eye is a photograph tucked behind the glass door of a bookcase. Lenin and Rykov. Looking at Rykov, you want to know more about the man. Natalia Rykova reminisces. He was slender, above average height, dark hair, an open face, radiant blue eyes. His beard and mustache were of a different shade, though. This circumstance caused a misunderstanding when my mother, also a party veteran, became acquainted with him. It was in Paris, in a flat Lenin occupied then. His wife, Nadezhda Krupskaya, was not in. Lenin was playing chess with Osip Pyatnitsky, a prominent party member who was also living in immigration in Paris. Suddenly, the doorbell rang. My mother went to open the door. She recounted that she opened the door and saw a stranger with an unmatching beard and mustache. Although he named the password correctly, she still had her doubts. What if he were a decoy? She whispered that to Lenin. Leaving his chessboard, Lenin went to have a look and burst out laughing. Well, some decoy. Such was his outward appearance, Rykov's daughter went on. As for his nature, he was of jovial disposition. He liked joking, like Bukharin, but was somewhat more restrained and introverted. He was fond of nature, but in a different way from Bukharin, who might go off hunting with his sketchbook. No, his love of nature was more down to earth, if you like. Even just outside the town, he would always have a look at the crops of oats or rye. His working habits, you ask. When he lived in the Kremlin, he would come home for lunch and then, lying down on the sofa, might say, "There will be a Sovnarkom meeting in 7 minutes. Please wake me up in 5. He often came back late, about 11 in the evening. He would have tea and do some reading, but if he came earlier, the whole family would go to the theater. His friends. I don't think I can single out anyone in particular. He used to have sincere, friendly relations with almost everybody. But I can well remember the time when his temper started changing for the worse. It was in 1930. And best of all, I remember the last months and weeks he was with us, because it concerned all of the family. In the summer of 1936, when I graduated from Teachers Training College, my father, then the People's Commissar for Communications, took me along on a business trip to the Soviet Far East. I acted as his secretary and typist. In the autumn of the same year, I started teaching Russian and Russian literature in a border guard school. Shortly after we had moved from the Kremlin to the house on the embankment, the school authority told me that I should resign. I knew it was useless to resist. At home, things were very bad. In December 1936, after attending sittings of the plenary meeting of the Central Committee, my father would return home increasingly gloomy. He would pace the room for hours on end. My mother and I would tell him time and again, "If you feel you are right, stand up for yourself." I remember when we read Bukharin's letter to the Politburo, it showed up the absurdity of the accusations leveled at him and my father. As we read that letter, it seemed to grow lighter in the room. The letter was so convincing. You'd better write as well, my mother said. My father looked at her meaningfully. I still remember that look of his, and snickered. Think anyone will take any notice? I well remember the day on the eve of the next plenary meeting of February-March 1937, when Ordzhonikidze died. Our last hope, my mother said. She had a stroke. My father attended the plenum. Coming back in the evenings, he was all blue in the face. He did not eat or smoke during the last 2 days. And on that very last day, he returned before dark and retired to his study. He did not answer my question, will you have to go there again? Then I decided to ring up the Kremlin myself. Poskrebyshev, Stalin's assistant, answered. I asked, will you be needing my father again tonight? I'll phone you back, Poskrebyshev replied. And he did. He said, the car is on its way. I helped my father on with coat and went out to see him off. We parted. He got into the car and drove off. I never saw him again. Yet another phone call interrupted our talk. Natalia Rykova thanked someone again for their memory. Memory has been living on in people for so many years. And what years? The point is that memory, especially if it is a good one, lives a longer life than man.